Violence in the workplace is increasingly becoming an issue of concern for both employers and employees worldwide. This is the case in all areas of work, and more specifically in healthcare environments and professions. According to a 2003 study conducted by an agency of the United Nations, violence in the healthcare sector may constitute almost a quarter of all violence at work. Indeed, according to the Canadian Nurses Association, healthcare professionals are at the highest risk for being attacked at work, even when compared to prison guards, police officers, bank personnel, and transport workers. For all these reasons, it is important that occupational therapists and their students be well informed about violence in the workplace. This module presents information about how it is defined, what its consequences, sources, and antecedents are, as well as the ways and means and the resources available for managing workplace violence. First, let's review the reasons why violence in healthcare workplaces may be increasing. The literature suggests that at the macro level, increasing violence in healthcare workplaces is occurring in the presence of mounting socioeconomic pressures that focus on controlling costs and increasing productivity. Relentless restructuring of healthcare environments over at least the past 2 decades has been demonstrated to produce stress and even burnout in its workforces. In addition, healthcare organizations must contend with increasing demands from growing and aging populations, advancing technology, and more sophisticated consumerism. Persons are living longer, and the proportion of elderly is increasing, resulting in expanding demands on healthcare, with ever increasing workloads that are rarely matched by increases in manpower. Increasing complexities in medical procedures are available in the treatment of more and more conditions, also resulting in increasing workloads. Finally, Albertans are becoming more aware of healthcare options and tend to expect more from the system. According to the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, these intense and continuous organizational changes, including downsizing, restructuring, and labor disputes, have been shown to increase risk of workplace violence. It is important for occupational therapists and students to recognize and deal with violence appropriately, and that begins with a clear and consistent definition. According to Alberta Health Services documentation, workplace violence exists on a continuum, from simple disregard of organizational procedures through to social isolation and disrespect of employees, and finally to threats and actual physical aggression. Violence refers to any act in which a person is abused, threatened, intimidated, or physically assaulted, up to and including homicide. Violence can be psychological or physical. It can be verbal, for example, in the form of yelling, use of condescending language, swearing, or outright insults. Or it can be nonverbal, for example, in written form or through the use of body language, such as eye rolling, turning one's back on a colleague, or alternatively, standing over someone in a threatening fashion. This definition is congruent with those developed and utilized by the World Health Organization, as well as numerous international bodies that are concerned with healthy workplaces. As such, they are commonly accepted and applicable to most, if not all, workplaces, whether or not one is employed by Alberta Health Services. Physical violence, of course, is easier to identify and includes, but is not limited to, such acts as slapping, pinching, spitting, kicking, shoving, pushing, beating. Sexual violence is assault that is based on gender and or sexuality and can present in either verbal or physical forms, including rape. According to the Alberta Human Rights Commission, sexual harassment is a violation of the Individual Rights Protection Act. It can include pinching, patting, comments and innuendo, or requests of a sexual nature and may or may not be intentional. At its most serious, unwanted sexual advances, unwanted requests for sexual favors, and other unwanted verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment when submission to such conduct is made explicitly or implicitly a term of or condition of an individual's employment, and submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual affects that individual's employment. Psychological violence is most often, though not always, perpetrated by colleagues and can be both horizontal, that is, worker to worker, or vertical, manager to supervisor, manager or supervisor to employee. The terms horizontal and vertical will be used throughout this module. This type of violence involves both action, such as verbal bullying and harassment, or the withholding of action, for example, the deliberate exclusion from relevant information for one's practice, and or preventing participation in decision making relevant to one's practice. Again, it may be done intentionally or unintentionally. Whatever form it takes, it often involves interactions between persons in different roles and power relationships. Although a single incident can suffice to fit the definition of psychological violence, it often consists of unwelcome, unreciprocated, and imposed upon action that have devastating effects. These actions may seem relatively minor in isolation, but cumulatively they can become very serious. Psychological violence in the form of bullying or harassment is specifically addressed in Alberta Health Services documentation. Bullying is defined as repeated, aggressive, or disrespectful behavior intended to hurt another person physically or mentally. According to AHS, it is characterized by an individual behaving in a certain way as to gain or maintain power over another person. Bullying can also include verbal harassment or threat, physical assault or harm, or coercion. For therapists employed outside AHS or those who are employers themselves, this definition is generic and can be taken as applicable to their respective workplaces. Bullying can become discrimination when it is perpetrated, on the basis of legally prohibited grounds such as race, religious beliefs, color, gender expression or identity, physical or mental disability, age, ancestry, place of origin, marital or family status, source of income, or sexual orientation. These situations can also involve human rights violations and may need to be managed a little differently as they cross over into the realm of civil legislation. The following unit discusses the consequences of these various forms of violence.